Okay, hi everybody. We're going to get started here for a little bit. Thanks for joining us today for the fourth webinar in this series. You're here for Sustainable Preservation Practices for Managing Storage Environments. And today we're going to be talking about dealing with temperature and moisture extremes in preservation environments. I'm going to be your presenter for today. My name is Jeremy Linden. I'm the Senior Preservation Environment Specialist at the Image Permanence Institute. And this is what happens when you let Chris get a hold of the presentation. I'm ably assisted by Christopher Cameron, our Sustainable Preservation Specialist in the background. He's going to be taking the questions as they come in today and kind of managing the technical aspects in the background. So if you have any problems or anything crops up, just write in and let him know. For technical support and information, I hope you guys are all used to this by now, but this is the slide. If you need anything, Lauren's available at her email address or at that phone number. If you're having any problems with the audio on this, do keep in mind that you can call in to a toll-free number. It's listed there. It's 1-562-247-8321. And the access code for today is not only listed on this slide, but should also be listed on the confirmation email that you got as part of your registration. And as always, as we go through, if you have any questions, unfortunately we do have to do this as sort of a one-way arrangement, but any questions that you have, feel free to type them into the question box and they'll come into Chris. And at the end of the webinar, we'll take a few minutes and try to get through as many of those as possible. We've got a lot to cover today. I'll do the best I can to make sure that we leave a few minutes for questions there at the end. Just as a reminder, this is the third series of these workshops and webinars that we've done. We started out last fall going through and doing a series of on-site workshops for 2 days apiece. And the program is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities through an education and training grant. This third time that we've been able to give this particular series, we're really grateful for that. It's a nice opportunity for us to talk with everyone out there in the field. And hopefully it's a nice opportunity for you guys to join us and kind of maybe pick up a few things in terms of what's new and what's different lately in preservation research and what we're doing in terms of environments. But just as an overview, we're looking to really find this better understanding of how we balance both preservation but also sustainability and what it is that we can do most often in terms of who we're talking with, most often in terms of collections staff or collections folks, what it is that we can do to participate in this particular goal. What can we do to both achieve the preservation goal, but also think about what's going on in management, administration, and our facilities side of our operations and houses. What is it that we can do to try and help reduce energy consumption and contribute to that sustainability goal? And our goal here really is to come up with some practical guidelines or practical approaches for how we can achieve sustainability without placing collections at risk or without having undue concerns about what might be happening to the environment as we go through some of these procedures. Today's focus specifically, if any of you folks have joined us in the past before, I'm sure you're probably going to recognize some aspect of this talk. It's one that we give fairly often. But we're going to focus today on dew point and how temperature, relative humidity, and dew point interact. We'll go through and talk for a few minutes over the dew point calculator, and I'll show you that just as a tool to be able to use and think about your interior conditions and how it is that your preservation environments are being created. We're going to talk a little bit about temperature and relative humidity extremes, although that's something that we also discussed in the first webinar a few months back. And then we're going to look a lot at outdoor conditions and what we can do in terms of dealing with outdoor conditions, what seasonal advantages different parts of the world and different parts of the U.S. might have, and the relationship between those outdoor conditions and what's going on inside of our buildings. So thinking a little bit, maybe new terminology for some of you, thinking a little bit about what loads are in terms of heat and moisture and where those heat and moisture loads are coming from or how it is that they're getting into the building. And just as maybe a sneak preview, if you will, we're going to take just a couple minutes at the very end and just talk very broadly about the idea of energy costs and what it means when we have to deal with those exterior loads in terms of system operation and what it might cost from the energy side. Although I will say that we're going to cover a lot of that a little bit further on. So today's focus is really that background information. It's what we need to know. It's introducing some of these concepts and making sure everyone has a solid understanding of what the relationship is between temperature, relative humidity, and dew point and the impact on the indoor environment. But as we move forward, I know a lot of you are probably tuning in and kind of waiting for, well, okay, I understand that part, but how do I go about fixing it? Or what are the solutions that we can go through and try and make improvements? And I just wanted to let you know that, well, we won't get into a lot of those strategies or solutions today. In the July and August webinars that are coming up, we'll be approaching that from two different aspects. On the 8th, we'll be talking a little bit more about building envelopes and how it is that we deal with passive environments or environments in buildings that may not have mechanical intervention. What can we do without necessarily having a system in place? And the following month in August, we'll take it from the other perspective. And for those buildings that do have mechanical systems or do have some sort of mechanical intervention, in order to control environments, we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of what the approaches might be, how those systems work, and what some of the strategies are for dealing with internal conditions and heat and moisture loads. So as a quick refresher, and hopefully this isn't anything new to anybody, but this is going back to the first webinar that we gave back in February. But what we're concerned with here is temperature to begin with, and we want to think of temperature as a form of energy. And for preservation purposes, our primary concern here is really temperature's effect on the rate of chemical decay. Our goal, by and large, is to try and keep temperatures within our storage environments relatively low to slow down that rate of chemical decay and keep the organic collections in particular lasting longer. And second, relative humidity is looking essentially at how saturated the air is with water vapor. And from this perspective, again, from the collection side or preservation, we're worried about the role that relative humidity plays in terms of three other forms of collections degradation. In this case, it's mechanical, biological damage, and metal corrosion. So if you have any questions about those, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but feel free to go back to the first and the second webinars in this series, and that'll fill some of that in for you. Because today, for the most part, we're going to spend most of our time talking about dew point. And, you know, if you'll humor me for a minute, I won't start singing, but I want to put it out there and make the argument that it's all about the dew point. And that's what it is that we need to keep in mind. Because dew point, when we think of it, we're using it as a measure of the absolute amount of moisture in the air. And the dew point, when we think of it from a psychrometric approach, it's the temperature at which air containing a specific amount of water becomes saturated. In other words, at what point can the air hold no more water than the system currently has in it? At what point is the air completely saturated? And if we hit that saturation point, any additional moisture that is put into the air will have to condense out. In other words, it cannot be maintained or cannot be suspended in the air any longer. And we're going to see that in the form of condensation, be it on the window in the photo or be it on a pop can sitting on a picnic table in the middle of summer. So the other aspect of looking at this is just sort of as a background definition. We're using dew point here as a representation of the actual amount of water in the air, or as one representation of the absolute humidity of the particular system we're dealing with. And one thing to keep in mind as we go through, and we'll go through and exhibit this a little bit as we see it in dew point calculator, but given a constant moisture content or given a constant dew point within a particular environment, we know that there are two relationships that hold true. As long as we have a constant dew point, we know that as temperature rises, the relative humidity will fall, and as the temperature falls, or as it gets cooler, the relative humidity will rise or go up. And keep those two things in mind, because I think you're going to understand that, or it'll be visualized a little bit better as we go through some of these exercises and look at dew point calculator. So why does it matter? Why is it all about dew point? Who cares? What we care about really is that as collections managers and as facilities managers and the folks that are trying to create the interior environments where the collections live, we're trying to create these combinations of temperature and relative humidity that exist within the safe ranges that are acceptable, looking at rates of degradation. So we know that as professionals on both sides of the house that we want to try and maintain relatively cool temperatures and moderate relative humidities, again what we talked about a few webinars ago, in order to maintain a safe environment from these four primary types of degradation that we're dealing with as far as this series is concerned. So we want to be able to slow down those rates of chemical decay and reduce the risk for mechanical damage, biological decay, and metal corrosion. And the dew point is really the limiting factor in terms of what it is that we can maintain for a temperature and relative humidity. It's all about the moisture content in a particular system. So the more dew point or the more moisture that we have in a system, we're going to have a hard time keeping a cool temperature without having a high relative humidity. And when we look at it in terms of mechanical control, or how it is that a building actually functions, the other critical thing about the dew point is when we think about what a building or a mechanical system might be capable of in terms of giving us a particular environment, the dew point by design is oftentimes the limiting factor of a mechanical system's ability to achieve a particular preservation quality within the environment. So if your mechanical system can't give you any better than a 55-degree dew point, that means you're going to be limited in terms of what sorts of temperatures and relative humidities you can maintain. And at the same time, if you find that you have a system or a dehumidification approach that can give you a dew point of 45 or 40, then it's going to open up a lot more possibilities in terms of what the good preservation environments or what types of preservation environments you might be able to create. We're not going to go into this too far. I just wanted to put it up there for folks that are familiar. This is the psychrometric chart. This particular version is from ASHRAE. But what we're dealing with here is this saturation temperature over on the upper left, if you will. But that's the dew point condition that we're looking at. And as you go through this and talk about relative humidity and dry bulb temperatures, we're not going to go into it all the way, but if anybody's looking at a psychrometric chart with their facility staff, or anybody wants to know where on the psych chart we're looking, this is what we're dealing with, is that dew point line or that saturation temperature. So to actually get down into this and talk a little bit about how it is that we think about dew point, or really how to understand dew point, because it can be something of a nebulous entity to try and really nail down what it is that it means and what that relationship is. Let's just talk about here let's just refer to this as concept A for a minute. And imagine that we have a whole series of buckets, if you will. And concept A really just says that as the air temperature increases, as we have a warmer temperature in the system that we're dealing with, the capacity of that air to hold moisture increases as well. So if you notice here, I'm going to pull up, there's my cursor, hopefully everybody can see this. But we're going to take a look here for a second. Notice down here that at 55 degrees at a cool air temperature in my environment, my bucket isn't very big. I don't have a whole lot of capacity to hold moisture in that particular condition. But as the temperature of the environment increases from 60 to 65 on up until we get to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, as one example, notice that the bucket is actually now quite substantial. There's a lot more capacity in that 80-degree Fahrenheit condition to hold moisture than there is at these cooler temperatures. So the warmer the temperature, the greater capacity to hold moisture. That's concept A. Concept B is that when we think about moisture in a particular environment, the actual amount of water that is in the environment or in the air doesn't change as we change the temperature. So notice again that I've got my indicators for what the temperature is in the space, but from 55 degrees on up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, my water amount doesn't actually change as we look in the environment that we're dealing with. So at no point through here is the actual amount of moisture present changing as we increase the temperature. No problem. When we combine those two, here we go. This is where we get relative humidity. In case you were ever wondering how exactly do we try and internalize relative humidity and what it means, this is where we're at. And you'll notice now that we have our same buckets. We've got our 55-degree bucket on up to our 80-degree bucket. And again, notice that as the temperature increases, our bucket gets bigger. We have more capacity to hold moisture. And that the actual amount of moisture present doesn't change. And as we look at these now, we recognize that really the concept of relative humidity is just telling us, well, how full is the air? How much capacity for moisture is there, for the air to hold is there, and how much moisture is actually present within the system. So as we look down here at 55 degrees with our relatively small bucket, if you will, at the moisture amount that we have, notice down here, we're 100% full. We can't get any more moisture into that condition. The air won't hold any more, and if we do, it's going to spill out the sides. It's going to condense. So here at 100% relative humidity, this is what we call an environment that is fully saturated with moisture. And that means that at this particular condition, 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 100% relative humidity, fully saturated, our dew point in this case is also 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Our saturation temperature, our dew point condition, is 55 degrees because that's where we're at 100% relative humidity. And as we move up and begin increasing these temperatures in the air, notice that, all right, if I take my system and I go from 55 degrees up to 70 degrees, well, now my air has more capacity to hold moisture, but I don't have any additional moisture present in the system. So here we are, my bucket is now only partially full, and if we want to put a number on it, there we go. I'm at 59% capacity. That means I have 59% relative humidity in this particular relationship. And again, as we increase the temperature a little bit more, notice that as the temperature goes up, the relative humidity drops. So by the time I get to 80 degrees, my relative humidity is down to 42%. My bucket's only 42% full. And this again is that relationship that we mentioned earlier. In this system, with a constant moisture content within the system, as the temperature drops, the relative humidity goes up. And as the temperature goes up, my relative humidity goes down. I hope everybody can see that relationship as we go through. This talk, honestly, is a little bit easier to give in front of a live audience because you can actually judge how it is that people are following along with you. And without being able to see everybody's face, I hope I'm keeping all of you with me. So let's take a look here at dew point for a minute. And this is where we want to take the idea of, well, all right, we know that we have a certain amount of moisture in the system, but how do we go about changing that amount of moisture? What if I'm not happy with the amount of moisture that I'm dealing with in my environment? So up here at the upper line, let's take a look at this top one for a second. Notice this is the same example we were using a minute ago. This is our 55-degree dew point condition. So at 55 degrees, got 100% relative humidity, bucket's completely full, and all right, let's now, the exercise here, the curiosity is let's move along here and talk about, in terms of preservation environments or in terms of collection storage, is there a set of numbers somewhere on the spectrum that looks kind of acceptable or pretty good in terms of preservation storage or in terms of collection storage? And we would say, yeah, let's shoot for that. Here we go. So at a 55-degree dew point, do I want a storage condition for my collections environment at 60 degrees? What kind of relative humidity is that going to give me? Hopefully everybody's looking at this. I'm losing my cursor again. There we go. Hopefully everybody's looking at me and going, 60 degrees, 84% relative humidity. Nope, that means mold growth and probably mechanical expansion, and things are going to be popping all over the place, and no, definitely not a good idea. All right, so we got to go a little bit warmer. We'll up it to 65 degrees. 70%, still mold risk. All right, still a little bit high in terms of mechanical decay. We don't want to get that much dimensional change going on in the materials. Keep moving up. All right, here we go. 70 degrees, 59%. This might be the first place where we look at it as a group on the preservation side or on the collection side and go, well, 59%, a little bit high for some things. We're still at risk for metal corrosion there. But maybe for book and paper, 59% is, let's say, at the upper limit of maybe what we want to hold. So this one could be considered, but in order to get that 50% relative humidity sort of happy medium that we look at and say this is pretty much good for everything, we've got to go to 75 degrees. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that for all of us, 75 degrees is a lot warmer than what we're going to want our standard storage environment to be. And at 75 degrees, we're increasing the risk for the rate of chemical decay. That's going to go a lot faster at that particular temperature. So as we look along this spectrum and think about, all right, recognizing that there are options, obviously, between 70 and 75 degrees. But what I hope we're taking away is that with a 55-degree dew point in our storage environment, we don't have a whole lot of acceptable options in terms of what we want our storage conditions to be or what we want the preservation environment to look like. 70 degrees and 59%, okay, not great, still a relatively high rate of chemical decay, maybe some risk for, maybe not dimensional change, but certainly for metal corrosion. Up here as we get to 75, yeah, we're treading the line all through here. So this one doesn't look so hot. Well, how do we get to a number that we like better? We know that we have too much moisture in the environment, and in order to get the moisture out, we've got to cool the temperature down, which is one way of dealing with it. We're approaching this from what's called a subcool and reheat operation. We're going to condense some of that moisture out of the environment. So we're going to take the air temperature that was at 55, and we're going to cool it down to 50 degrees. And if you will, I'm making my bucket smaller. So I'm going to cool that down to 50 degrees. Now I've got a 50-degree bucket over here. Notice that that is now fully saturated as well. So at 50 degrees and 100% relative humidity, I've created a 50-degree dew point. And all of that moisture that existed between this 50-degree dew point and 55-degree dew point is now condensed out of the system. It's formed as liquid water and has been drained off of the system. So here we are at our 50-degree dew point. Now we ask ourselves the same question. Is there a preservation environment at a 50-degree dew point that I can look at and say this is acceptable for my collection? Well, so move up through. All right, cool, 60 degrees, 69%. Nah, it doesn't sound good. Here we go, 70 degrees and 50%. Sound familiar to anybody? All right, as we go through, hopefully this is going to take us back to webinar 1 and think about the fact that we have our 70-50 kind of rule that existed for a number of decades in our profession, right? So we look at this and go, oh, all right, now I get it. For 70 degrees and 50% relative humidity, I have to create a 50-degree dew point in my space. That's the amount of moisture. I need the amount of moisture that's equivalent to a 50-degree dew point in order to maintain that condition. Well, all right, that sounds pretty good. But if you think back again to the webinar, to the first webinar and what we talked about, one of the things that we discussed was that 70-50 condition, from the perspective of chemical rates of chemical decay, still isn't really what we're looking for long-term preservation of most of our materials, particularly the organics. So when we're looking at 70 degrees and 50%, yes, that's been the standard for a while, but that's being rethought. We recognize now as a profession that cooler temperatures at moderate relative humidities are better. So at 50-degree dew point here, can we go any cooler than 70 degrees? 65 degrees, 58%. That puts us in that same category of maybe okay for some things, but certainly not okay for others. So do we have a lot of flexibility at a 50-degree dew point? Well, we can get to something that, yeah, might be passable, but isn't really what we're looking for. Remember, we're changing the game here a little bit and saying that we want to try and get to a cooler temperature at a moderate RH. So let's push it. Let's go a little bit further. Let's take some more moisture out of the environment. I'm not happy with a 50-degree dew point. I'm going to take a 45-degree dew point and see what that gets me. Cool the air down. My bucket's smaller yet again. I can only hold that much moisture in the environment at a 45-degree dew point. All the excess moisture is condensed out. And as I start moving up my spectrum here, looking at it and get to, hey, here we go. Now we're starting to get into a range where this looks a little bit better in terms of overall preservation, right? Now I can achieve a 65-degree temperature in my storage space at a 48% relative humidity, and I have successfully, at this condition, if I can maintain those set points, I've slowed the rate of chemical decay compared to 70 degrees. And at 48% relative humidity, assuming we might do a flat line in this particular example, but at 48% relative humidity, I'm at no risk for mechanical damage. There's no risk in particular for dimensional change if we hold it steady. And there's no risk of metal corrosion or of any sort of biological decay or problem occurring, such as mold. And this 48% actually reduces the risk of pests as well. So this is the power of dew point, and that's why it matters. You know, this is when we go in and we start talking and working with people. You know, the one thing that we always want to keep in mind as preservation professionals and as collection staff is that this moisture content within our environment is really kind of ruling the roost. If we can't get enough moisture out of the environment, then we're going to have an awfully hard time controlling the relative humidity to where we want it without having temperatures that we're going to look at and say, that's not acceptable for collection storage. If we want to have those cool temperatures and we want to have those moderate relative humidities, and, you know, we've talked about it in the past. There's a graphic coming up here in a minute, but, you know, moderate relative humidities, let's put it out there broadly, is give or take about 35 to 55% for a lot of our materials. You know, when we define it in those terms, you need to have typically a lower dew point condition in order to maintain that range of relative humidity at a cool air temperature. So I hope that's useful, and please do keep in mind that all of these slides will be available through the IPI Sustainability website after the talk. So feel free, if you need to kind of work on this graphic a little bit or think about it or experiment with it yourself, the graphic will certainly be available. So I'm going to take a second here, and I'm not going to spend too long on it, but I want to show you dew point calculator real quick. And we'll pull that up. Hopefully everybody can see this. So this is a tool. It's at dpcalc.org, dpcalc.org. This is a tool that we created now. Wow, this is pushing 15 years ago, actually maybe a little bit longer, 16 or 17 years ago now. We designed this here at IPI, and our goal here really is to do a couple of things. One, the dew point calculator, for all intents and purposes, is just the psychrometric chart put into slider form. So if we look at these relationships between temperature, relative humidity, and dew point that we use over here on the sliders, if you go back to the psychrometric chart, it's that same relationship. This is just a little easier way of using it and sort of internalizing it, if you will. But over here on the right-hand side, this is the other aspect of what we use it for, is we have the metric, the preservation metrics over on the right-hand side. So notice we've got the metric for natural aging over here, preservation index, mechanical damage, mold risk, and metal corrosion. And really, our use of the tool, although there are a whole lot of other ones that you can put it to, but our use of the tool is to look at it and say, all right, if I have a particular environmental condition, let's say that I'm dealing with a system or a building that doesn't have a whole lot of mechanical control, and in the summertime, here in Rochester, my historic building is going to be dealing with a 78 degrees and a 65% relative humidity condition. Be patient, I'm using a trackpad on this laptop, so the mouse control isn't all that hot. But let's say we've got 78 degrees and 64%. Well, that gives us a 66 degree dew point. And based on our conversation of just a moment ago, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, you know what, 66 degree dew point, that's probably not a very good preservation condition. I've got a high temperature going on. I've got a high relative humidity. Uh-oh, you go over and look at the metrics, and all of a sudden we realize we've got the red lights popping up all over the place, right? We've got a high rate of chemical decay. We've got a high risk for metal corrosion. Now, we're not high enough quite yet for mold risk in terms of relative humidity, but this is the approach of the tool. So let's just use a couple of examples here for a moment. And we talked about this back in webinar 1, but I want to illustrate it for you. And when we looked at that dew point graphic, we said, all right, there's 70 degrees and 50% RH. Here's my 50 degree dew point. What kind of a preservation environment does that actually give me? Well, here we are over at the preservation index. That's 39, and we talked about the metrics a few weeks or a few months ago now. But so I'm not going to go into it in depth, but just to say, you know what, that preservation index, that PI of 39, not so hot. I really want that to be a higher number in order to achieve what I'm looking for long-term preservation conditions and long-term collection storage. So 70-50, while it might be a great human comfort condition, and it might be a very comfortable working condition for us, if we're talking about where our collections are going to live forever and forever, you know, if all things being equal, if we had our druthers, argument says 70-50, maybe not the first choice. Maybe we want to go a little bit cooler. So what does that take? Let's see what happens if we drop this off. What do we get when we get to 60 degrees? All right, 72 PI. That means we're about 80% better than we were before. So just that 10 degree drop, notice the impact that it has on your preservation quality, but notice also the impact that it has over here on our dew point slider. That as I change that temperature from 70 degrees down to 60 degrees, that means that instead of controlling to a 50 degree dew point, now I have to have the ability to create a 42 degree dew point in that environment. And we're going to talk about it here for a couple of minutes, but I'm going to put out there to everybody that maintaining a 42 degree dew point, particularly in summer for a lot of places, not only throughout the US, but also throughout the world, is quite a challenge. We'll illustrate that here in just a second. So just a couple other ideas to kind of put out there so you're aware of how this guy works. Let's take a real quick look and say, well, what happens in a mold growth condition? What might I be looking at? So let's say I've got my, I can control temperature all right, no problem. Here we are at 70 degrees. But we're going to make the argument that, all right, mold growth starts up here about 70%, give or take. Here we are with our 60 degree dew point. And, how quickly am I going to grow mold? Well, this is a lookup table that depends on temperature and relative humidity levels. But that's telling us that in about 86 days, we're likely to see germination. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just the idea that, you know what, after give or take about 2.5 months, pushing 3 months, you might want to start looking around and looking for green fuzzy stuff and make sure it's not growing. So there's how we can use it in terms of projecting what the preservation risk might be based on certain environmental conditions. And finally, what is the certain benefit of different preservation conditions? There are a lot of folks out there, a lot of larger institutions anyway, that are thinking about off-site storage and what sort of preservation environment do we create in off-site facilities. And if you go back to the Harvard depository model, which was kind of the granddaddy of them all, if you will. We're sitting here and looking at 50 degrees in temperature, 30% relative humidity. That gives us a 20-degree dew point. A little bit tricky to achieve. That's getting into desiccant systems, but we'll talk more about that in a couple months. But look over there at the preservation quality. Now we've got a PI of 283. Compared to at 7050, I think we had a PI of 39. So one way of looking at this is that we've just increased the life of our collections from a chemical decay perspective by a factor of 7. Not bad, right? You pay for it. But your collections, your organic materials, are going to last a whole lot longer in 5030 than they are in 7050. And that's the power of those cooler temperatures and those lower relative humidity conditions. So just real quick, that was an illustration of dew point calculator. If you ever have any questions about this or how to use it, please feel free to get in touch with myself or with Chris or anybody else here at IPI. You might be able to tell, but we really enjoy playing with it and kind of using it for different examples. So yeah, don't ever hesitate to ask. Let's go back for a second over here to the PowerPoint. We'll get back into the slides here for a moment, but here we are again with dew point calculator, and that's just a quick screenshot with a link if anybody has any questions. But what it really comes down to is that, if we think about this in terms of what is the dew point that I need, or what is it the dew point that I currently have, dew point's one of those things that, as I said before, can be a little bit nebulous to track down or think about. It's not necessarily the language that our facility staff always work within. The facility staff is working with a set of set points, just the way we are. So they're more apt to look at it in terms of temperature and relative humidity as well. And when you go back and you look at mechanical system design, if you're using mechanical systems to control the environment, when you look at design capabilities on systems, you don't even usually get dew point numbers on the design capability or on the system schedules. You're looking at those numbers and getting different conditions like wet bulb temperature and dry bulb temperature. And in order to get to the dew point, you've got to run a calculation on those. So the key thing, the nice thing about dew point calculator is to think about the actual moisture and how much moisture we're dealing with. Plug your temperature and relative humidity that you have in your space and in your collections environments right into dew point calculator and see what kind of moisture control your system is giving you, or what kind of moisture conditions you have in your building. And take that opportunity to look at the preservation impact of that. And as a general rule, this is just something to keep in mind. And I know there are a lot of folks that are joining us from smaller institutions or institutions that don't have mechanical intervention in their buildings. And we are going to spend a lot more time on that when we get to, I think it's the July webinar. Next month will be equilibration. But when we get to July and we start talking about buildings that don't have mechanical systems or don't have any form of humidification or dehumidification, maybe they just have temperature control. When we're thinking about moisture content indoors, if we don't have a means of adding moisture, removing moisture, that means that the moisture content inside the building is going to be very similar to the moisture content outside of the building in the external environment. So we'll talk about it a little bit more, but if you don't have a means of controlling moisture, your indoor and outdoor dew points are going to be very similar to one another. So what are we dealing with outside? I know we dealt with outdoor conditions a little bit, maybe back in the first webinar, but let's dive into a little bit further here because we really need to appreciate what it is that we're all contending with. And for the folks in Alaska and Hawaii, I really apologize that your states don't show up on this particular map. Call NOAA and say, hey, look, come on, help us out here. But for these particular graphics, this is for the United States. This is from National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. But what we're looking at here are really different seasonal mean dew point conditions throughout the country. So notice that even as we get up here into the Northeast, and here we are up in Rochester. Hi, everybody. It's a beautiful day. But even as we get up here into the Northeast in July, we've got fairly high dew point conditions, high amounts of outdoor moisture that we're contending with in our environment that we have to figure out. If I've got between a 60 and a 65 degree dew point outside, well, looking back at the bucket list, if you will, that was an interesting way of phrasing it, but going back to the buckets for a moment, a 60 or 65 degree dew point isn't going to do me any good in terms of indoor preservation conditions. That's going to be quite the challenge. So even in New York, we've got something to contend with. And get down here to Louisiana, New Orleans, where we're going to be in a couple of weeks, in Florida, when these folks are dealing with 70 to 75 degree dew points, it's an even bigger challenge. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of work that has to be done, which when we say work, we're going to talk, it's going to entail energy. But there's a lot of work that has to be done to remove that moisture from the air before the air comes into the building. We don't want all of that heavy moisture-laden air to come directly into our storage environment and increase the relative humidity conditions surrounding our collections. Now, on the other side of the coin, when we get over here into the American Southwest and even on up here into the mountain region, notice that even in what we expect to be the quote-unquote more arid parts of the country, there's still some dew point challenge going on here. And it's really not until we get into the higher elevations that we start to see lower dew points throughout the year that now mean the opposite of dehumidification. And as we see what is more typical for the U.S. in particular in the wintertime, now we have a whole lot of conditions throughout the country, arguably really anywhere above Georgia. We're going to be dealing with outdoor conditions that require us to humidify or add moisture to the air in order to get the dew points that we want inside. So just think about those for a minute and kind of mentally place yourself, where are we on that map, and does that go according with what we have to try and contend with or deal with? Are we worried about dehumidifying in summer and humidifying in winter? So in terms of management of that, well, what do we do? How does that work? The reality is most of our moisture inside the building is coming directly from outdoors. We do create some of it. If we're at home in particular, you've noticed that, your bathroom gets steamy if you take a shower, and we create moisture loads inside of a space just because of human occupancy. But when we look at collection storage and we think about the fact that, all right, all things being equal, we probably don't have a sink in the same space as where we store the collections for the long-term period. And we try to reduce, oftentimes, the amount of traffic through there and make sure that there aren't any sources of water. Every now and again we get a roof leak and that defeats us. But for the most part, the moisture that we're dealing with inside the building is brought in from outside. It either sneaks in through the envelope or we bring it in on purpose as part of the mechanical system. And really, when we talk about managing that moisture, managing those dew points, we only have three options available to us. And generally, I label these as first options as kind of the let it ride. And then we have the option of adding moisture, or we can get rid of moisture. So let's talk about for a second what those look like. So here we go. This is the let it ride approach, if you will. This is what happens when we have a building that doesn't have any means of mitigating moisture content. Basically, what's going on outside is what's going on inside. This is a space that's off the coast of Maine, and it's an historic building. Built, I want to say it was late 1800s, give or take. Nobody fire me if I'm slightly off on that date. But yeah, you look at this and you realize, all right, our outdoor moisture content, which, oh, by the way, the dew point's pretty high, right? We get into the summertime and we're dealing with 65 to 70 degree dew points. Now in the winter it does drop, but notice how throughout the winter we still have these days of 30 to 40 degree dew points, and through November and December even higher than that. So moisture content can be a real challenge. And when we look at the interior space inside of the building, here in the fishing room, we wind up with a scenario where the interior tracks right along with what the exterior is doing. There's very little buffer, there's very little mitigation, there's very little removal of moisture before it gets into the space. And what we're left with is an interior dew point that looks the same as outside. And if we had to guess, given that there's no mechanical intervention or control, we're going to see temperatures and relative humidities that look very similar as well. That if we look at these dew points and we look at what the RHs are in the summertime, we know that that's probably going to equate to a very serious mold risk throughout a fair portion of the season. Here's the other way of doing it, and that's if we do have a way of mitigating moisture, whether it's adding it or removing it, we can start to see the difference between what goes on inside and what's happening outside. So here on the yellow plot, we've got Washington, D.C. This is what we're doing in terms of outdoor dew point. This is what Mother Nature gives us. Notice, again, in wintertime, low moisture contents, all right, but in summertime, above a 70 degree dew point, that's a bit of a challenge. D.C. was built on a swamp, so I guess that all holds true. And notice that what we have to do here is in the season when we humidify, we're taking the outdoor condition, the low amount of moisture that outdoors gives us, and we're adding to it. That space here between the yellow plot and the green plot. We're adding some moisture to that environment. We're increasing the dew point. and that's probably going to allow us to hold a better relative humidity condition in the wintertime. Notice here we get to a little bit of a shoulder season where the indoor dew point tracks along a little bit more closely with what's going on outside. It's not exact, but we do see that there's a little closer relationship between those two conditions. By the time we get into the high moisture content period of summer, here we are. We've got 70 degrees plus in terms of dew point. Not going to work for indoors, not for collection storage. And we kick into dehumidification mode on the mechanical system, and they're maintaining, give or take, about a 48-degree dew point inside the building at that time of the year. So this is our dehumidification. And this is the difference. Again, these are the other two options. I can either humidify or add moisture to the environment in order to get the proper relative humidity that I want, or I can dehumidify or remove moisture from the environment, again, to achieve the appropriate preservation condition. So to go back and think about this a little bit, we're going to explore this outdoor environment a little bit more, the outdoor climate a little bit more. But this is something that we introduced again back in webinar 1, and it's the idea that it's really the extremes of temperature and moisture that matter most for what we want to worry about for preservation. And we'll talk about this a little bit more again as we get into the equilibration talk next month. But the idea here is that we want to know what is the worst that outside is going to give us, and what is it that we're going to do about that? How do we contend with it? And how do we find sort of this happy medium condition? We talked about cooler and moderate relative humidities. What can we do? How much do we have to fight against the outdoors in order to try and achieve that? And in order to really get down to the bottom of this, we have to understand a couple of different aspects of how the whole physics and how the relationship between outdoors and our buildings work. We need to know what it is that the outdoors is doing. So what does it give us in our local climate area? We need to know what the sources of excess heat and moisture are. In other words, what are those loads that we're going to contend with? And where do they come from? How does the heat get in, or how does the moisture get in? We want to monitor the space that we're talking about for preservation conditions. We want to monitor those conditions year-round so that we understand over time not only what goes on outdoors, right? We're all kind of familiar with the fact that it gets cold and dry in the winter and hot and muggy in the summer, at least here in Rochester. And other places are hot and muggy year-round, and everybody has their own weather pattern to deal with. Outdoors is fairly easy, but the indoors can be a little bit tricky because we don't know necessarily how exactly our building or the mechanical system, if we have one, contends with those outdoor conditions throughout the year. And we're looking for these seasonal and yearly trends so that we can find the patterns, so that we can understand, okay, we're okay in terms of dealing with it in the winter. We know how to take care of that. We can add a little bit of moisture. But where we really fall short, where we really have problems, is managing moisture content in the summertime. My temperatures are too high, my relative humidities are too high, and I need to have the data from data logging, from monitoring, to be able to show that these are the trends, and this is what we have to work on and what we have to try and improve. And the final part of this here, I'm going to spend some time on this today, but it's not, the other thing to keep in mind is that we don't always necessarily want to fight Mother Nature. We don't always necessarily want to look at outdoors and go, uh-oh, that's bad, because every now and again, if we look at outdoors and if we start thinking about it in this broader sense of how we approach preservation and the fact that it doesn't always have to be a flatline condition, we find all of a sudden that for a lot of the U.S. and for a lot of places around the world, that there are seasons, there are opportunities where we can take advantage of what's going on outdoors to both improve preservation conditions inside and also reduce the energy costs that we're using in order to create those interior environments. So here we go. Average annual temperature, right? Now, looking at this, we begin to appreciate that really, in the U.S., we're fairly fortunate, and when we look at Europe, fairly fortunate as well. There are a few parts of the southern U.S. that are really facing some challenges of high outdoor temperatures. But in terms of equatorial conditions, we're not exposed to a lot of that here in the U.S. or in Europe. It's really, we get into Saharan Africa, we get into South America and India, Southeast Asia, where we're dealing with those conditions, and it's a whole different test. And that's something that unfortunately I can't go into a whole lot during this particular talk. It's something that we'll touch on basically in terms of buildings without mechanical systems here in a couple of months. But it's also an area where we recognize that as a profession, there's a lot more work to be done and a lot more thought to be given to how do we create appropriate preservation conditions in some of these particularly challenging external environments. So we have average annual temperature, all right. When we break it down to the U.S., what do we see? Well, pretty much what we all expect, right? We've got a portion of the country, really, particularly throughout here and on up into the Northeast, where we've got fairly warm conditions throughout the summer, you know, depending on who you ask, sometimes actually hot. And then when we get to winter, we get fairly cold conditions, right? We get really less than 1 degree up here in terms of northern Minnesota, but even here in New York, we dropped down. We had long stretches, at least probably pushing a month and a half or 2 months this winter where we never got above freezing. And that's a pretty cold stretch. It's a challenge. You know, whereas you look down here at Miami, for all of you who are going to AIC next week, we'll see you there. But you look down here at Miami and you realize, all right, they're dealing with the heat all the time. And not only are they dealing with the heat, but as we'll see in a minute, we're going to be dealing with moisture all the time too. So everybody has a slightly different challenge to work with. And we're going to approach these in a couple different examples. Annual relative humidity, here we are again. Is it what we expected? By and large, yeah, right? Stays a little bit damper here throughout the U.S. and notice again throughout the northern climes, stays a little bit warmer. And here in particular, we have this stretch throughout the world in terms of looking at latitude where we have very arid conditions that can be a challenge. Some of these do associate with high elevation. Some of these just associate with what the weather patterns and where they are in terms of outdoor environments. So the challenge here really is to recognize again that we're dealing with a lot of different conditions globally. And, you know, again, it's part of our recognition and one of the challenges that we do a lot of work here in the United States. A lot of our funding is through the United States government in terms of research with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute for Museum and Library Services. You know, and sometimes it's a challenge to find the opportunities to study what's happening internationally or what's happening in external or outdoor climates that are not the same as what we deal with here in the U.S. But just to say, even staying close to home, you know, there are vast differences between how we think about moisture and temperature control for collections environments and how you do it compared to between Rochester, New York and Tucson, Arizona. And those are things that we do want to be thinking about and considering. For anybody that can still hear me, if you would just send in a comment to Chris real quick.
You're back, you're back.
Okay. Hopefully I'm back. I don't know how much we lost there. Hopefully everybody can hear us at the moment. But we'll go back to this. What I want you to take away here real quick, and oftentimes we show this in graph format. Perfect. Thanks for all the comments, guys. Very helpful. All right. So as we come back and look at this, relative humidity throughout the year, one thing to take away, and this has to do with that relationship between temperature and relative humidity and the moisture content. Keep in mind throughout most of the United States, and I'm just going to deal with US here for a moment, but throughout most of the United States, as we get into the winter months, we start to lose moisture content in the outdoor environment. It actually drops. There are a few exceptions to that, the Pacific Northwest and down around New Orleans. But for the most part, as we look at this, the dew point is going to go down significantly throughout the year. And really, but keep in mind that because temperatures also drop, as we get into the winter months, even though the moisture content is lower because we're dealing with cooler temps, notice that our relative humidities stay high. So for example, here in Rochester, just use that as the example, February, average relative humidity, 66 to 75%. July, look at that, same thing. Who would have thought? Because oftentimes when we think about dryness, we think about indoor conditions. If we say that the winter is a dry period of the year, well, it usually does hold true in terms of dew point conditions, but how we manifest it as people is thinking about the spaces that we heat, that we increase the temperature in the wintertime. And that process of heating with a low moisture content gives us a very low relative humidity. When we look at the lower temperature conditions outdoors, even at low dew point conditions, we can still maintain these high relative humidities throughout the course of the year. So keep that in mind. Just because it may feel dry indoors, outdoor relative humidities, and really dew point is the better way of looking at this, but outdoor relative humidities stay high throughout the year for a lot of parts of the U.S., or conversely stay low, if you will. Precipitation levels, we're not going to stay on this for too long. I need to kind of bump through this, but really when we look at it, where we have a lot of humidity or where we have a lot of precipitation, also, not coincidentally, happens to be where we see high relative humidity levels throughout the year. So again, kind of matches the map that we're looking at. We have high relative humidity throughout the east, and these arid portions where we see, on average, lower relative humidity conditions are also the areas where we get less precipitation by and large. So sources of outdoor heat load, what are we dealing with? Well, what's going on? What are we trying to think of? First of all, obviously, it's the outside air temperature, right? If it's a 90-degree day outside, it's going to be awfully warm inside. We're going to have a lot of heat to contend with and try to keep out of the building. But when we think about how it is that that heat impacts the building, or how it is that the building actually warms up, part of it is the outdoor air temperature, and part of it is conduction, that temperature moving through the building and warming up the inside of the surface. But we also have the issue of solar gain, and we also have this issue of convection too. So we've got radiant energy that comes in from the sun, and the amount of radiant energy that we contend with can be, in many ways mitigated by whether it's a cloudy day or not. What is our orientation to the sun? This is a big one. If we've got a building that has, let's say, glass walls or a glass exterior that faces south and west, here in the United States, guess what? You're going to get a lot of sun exposure throughout the day on that southwest portion of your building. So if you've got a building that is aligned toward the north or the northeast, where we don't get as much sun exposure throughout the course of the day, you're not going to get nearly as much load coming in through that wall, nearly as much energy. Another factor in here, and we've got window glazing and shading down on the list, but really this is looking at the envelope in general, and we'll spend a little bit more time on building envelopes in July. But looking at window glazing and shading, how much ability to either block or reflect some of that energy and some of that radiant energy back out of the building do we have? And finally, the nature of the structure. Do we have a lot of thermal insulation in the structure, or do we have an historic building which may not have a whole lot of thermal capacity, and there's a very easy transfer of energy from the exterior of the building to the inside? Moisture, on the other hand, is very similar, really, if we look at it. Right, we've got atmospheric moisture that's coming through on weather fronts. So for everybody that's sitting in New York or Western New York, every time we get a front coming over Lake Erie, guess what? We tend to get some rain. We've got annual precipitation patterns, right? Those are the maps we just looked at. Our nearness to open water. Anybody who's in a coastal environment can attest to this one. Guess what? You're dealing with high dew points and high relative humidities almost throughout the year. Groundwater, this is varying issue. This is a varying issue throughout the country. Here in the Northeast and in the eastern U.S., there's a lot of groundwater, oftentimes a relatively shallow water table. So if you have a basement or a subgrade portion of your building, oftentimes water incursion can be a real challenge. The water will come up either through the floor or even through the walls. As you move west, as you move to the more arid parts of the country where the water table's oftentimes significantly lower, that can be an entirely different challenge. Air leaks through the building envelope. Now, really, there are two ways in general that moisture travels across our building. One way is that the moisture comes in with air through just general leaks. So if we've got poorly sealed windows or poorly sealed doors and that air can come from outside to inside, well, it brings the dew point along with it, and that then makes it into our building and we have to contend with it. But the other thing that happens is that we have this process of diffusion, which is really primarily dependent upon vapor pressure. But if we're looking at, if you will, a high moisture content or a high moisture environment outdoors, and we have an indoor environment that we are mechanically controlling or that we're drying out and dehumidifying and creating a low moisture content, then the movement of moisture, that diffusion process, is going to be for the high concentration of moisture outdoors to try and make its way indoors through the envelope of the building. And this is where vapor barriers, or this is where vapor retention or retardant comes in when we're looking at building construction, when we're looking at envelopes. And again, we'll spend a little bit more time on that in a couple of months, but when we think about how to reduce indoor moisture, those passive approaches of trying to use vapor barriers and seal buildings are significant strategies to try and reduce that moisture incursion into a structure. levels that we can contend with, or how do we think about this sort of in an outside-in approach? We've got our local climate. What does outdoors give us? And we've got our building envelope. What is it capable of doing? Can it keep out temperature? Can it keep out moisture? Do we have some thermal and do we have some moisture barrier in place? On older buildings, that's usually a challenge. On newer buildings, we're getting better and better at putting those types of systems in place when we look at construction. Now, inside of a modern building, we might have some version of a mechanical system that can be meant to do temperature control or moisture control or variation on each. And what it's capable of, or what it's capable of doing, can be a big part of how we control the interior environment. And finally, here at the bottom, the other one, and this is the storage environment in general. You know, the influence of all three of these is what gives us the air condition in the storage environment. There's one more step that we're going to talk about next month, and that's what can we do in terms of creating microenvironments within storage environments. How can we take the conditions that we're given in a general storage space and try to mitigate those even further or buffer those by using some form of furniture or some form of container, housing, boxes, different vitrines or different display techniques. What can we do to try and reduce that likelihood that the air condition, and oftentimes moisture is the primary culprit here, that we can create a microenvironment for our materials to live within inside of that environment. Seasonal advantages. We're going to travel around the country a little bit. We're going to take our virtual IPI tour, if you will, but we're going to show what the impact is of dew point conditions in different climates. And here's what I want you to think about is what temperature and relative humidity do we want to try and maintain? I'm going to give some examples, but hopefully some of you are sitting in these environments that we're going to be giving some examples for, and think about it. You know, what would you like to do for your collection space, or what are you doing in terms of temperature and relative humidity conditions? And we'll look real quick what dew point condition is required to achieve the temp and RH that we want. And finally, we're going to spend just a moment and talk about how much work, or if you will, how much energy is required to achieve some of these preservation conditions that we're going to talk about. Hopefully these look familiar. We brought these up. This is just a quick review. We brought these up back in the first webinar. But we're working along these spectrums of what are safe temperatures and relative humidities. You know, where do we want to sit for collections preservation? And we're going to use this kind of general approach of thinking between give or take 50 to 54 and 65 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit. And really 30, 35 to 55% relative humidity for what we want for that RH zone. So we're going to work within those bounds here for a minute. All right, example one. What do we do in a cooler, damp environment? Well, I'm going to throw this out, and you guys can agree or disagree, but let's give it a shot here and see if we can get 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity. What's that going to take? And that's, by the way, going to require a 45-degree dew point and give us a preservation index of 56 if we hold it at a flatline condition. Pretty good, okay? Well, Seattle, you guys qualify as cool and damp, at least compared to Rochester anyway. But let's take a look here for a second. In Seattle, Washington, here we are. Here's our 45-degree dew point. And what I want you to keep in mind, if we can maintain that condition, we'll get a fairly good preservation environment out of that. 65-50 looks okay. We're good in terms of all of our various kinds of collections degradation. But notice here, I want you to think about work for a second. If we hold this flatline 65-50% condition, that means we've got to create a 45-degree dew point all the time, all throughout the year. And this red plot in the background is what outdoors is giving us. This is what Seattle gets naturally. So if I want to hold 45-degree dew point inside of a building, and this is what outdoors is giving me, well, notice that everywhere above the line, I'm going to have to dehumidify. I have to take some moisture out of that air in order to maintain my 45-degree dew point condition to hit my set points. And everything here south of the line, if you will, I'm going to have to humidify. Sounds a little bit odd for Seattle, but I'm going to have to add humidification to this air in order to maintain that flatline condition throughout the year. So one lesson to take away from here is, does this give us a decent preservation environment? Yeah, it does. But it comes at a cost, because if we look at that moisture control, there are very few points throughout the course of this year where we're not doing some sort of work to that environment to achieve that flatline condition. We have to spend energy up here, and we have to spend energy down here as well. So there's option A. Let's try option B. What can we do a little bit differently? Well, let's say that we're willing to take this seasonal approach and think about it in that manner. And I'm sitting in Seattle and going, all right, for my collection, for my broad swath of materials that I'm dealing with, I'm okay with a 65-degree temperature, but you know what? For the drier part of the year, might sound a little odd for Seattle, but for the drier part of the year, I'm all right with 35% relative humidity. I'm going to go toward the lower end of that safe range. And I'm going to give myself a 36-degree dew point to contend with. So here we are. Here's my 36-degree dew point. And you know what? For the damper part of the year, for the wetter part of the year, that does again happen during the summer and the early fall. Here's my 65-degree temperature, but I'm going to allow my RH to creep up to 55%. That's at the limit of what I think is a safe range for my collection. And here's where I'm going to control it to. Notice what happens. And I didn't run numbers on all of these because we honestly didn't have time to go through all of that. But I hope you can visualize the impact here. And that's to say that compared to this slide and how much work we did both below the line and above the line in terms of dehumidification here and humidification here, if I work with this set of set points, if I work with these different seasonal conditions, notice now that this significantly reduces the amount of dehumidification that I have to do. Now I'm dehumidifying primarily just for these periods as opposed to a whole lot of stuff through here. And notice also, remember how we said it sounded a little bit odd to have to humidify in Seattle? You know, okay, we think of it as a damp place. Well, if we go back and we think about this 35% relative humidity, a 36-degree dew point, notice that sure, there's still a few periods here and there where the outdoor moisture content is lower. We might have to add a little bit of moisture, but by and large, we've taken a lot of the humidification load out of that equation. We've really reduced the amount of work that we have to do in order to maintain what is still not only an acceptable preservation environment, but if you go by the grade of long-term chemical stability, this is actually a significantly better preservation environment. So again, just an idea between, instead of a flatline condition, maybe these seasonal variances, maybe these seasonal set points, even in a place like Seattle, Washington, can work to our advantage both in terms of preservation and in terms of what we're doing for looking at energy use or energy consumption. We'll try another one. Hot and dry, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's see if we can create 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 35% RH. Okay. Now that's presuming that a lot of the time we're going to have dew points that are quite low, that we have to figure out how to add moisture into that environment. All right. We're going to use Tucson, even though Tucson certainly does have a wet season in the summertime. But let's look at Tucson's dew point here for a minute and just say, all right, if I want to maintain 65-35 throughout the year, and I'm just saying, you know what, this is the set point that I'm going to match. All right, well, here we are for a portion of the year where I certainly have to humidify. Not necessarily a surprise. We're going to add some moisture to the environment in order to achieve the dew point at a 36-degree dew point and get that preservation condition that we want. But notice that, holy cow, here we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-month period at least, maybe a little bit longer, where if I want to maintain that relative humidity in that dew point, that 36-degree dew point, that is a whole lot of dehumidification that I've got to figure out how to do. And while I will get a good preservation condition out of it, can I afford to do that much work? How might this work a little bit differently and still give me a good preservation option? Well, take it back to option 2, right? Here we are, same condition, but for that 65-35, let's make that our target for these drier months. That way we're not over-humidifying, right? We're not trying to bring this up to a 50-degree dew point and getting it up into this range. That would be even more work, wouldn't it? But here we go. We can maintain 35% relative humidity if we can get it to this 36-degree dew point. Pretty good. And here when we get into summer, remember, if I'm willing to take a look at that and say, all right, 55% relative humidity is still safe for a lot of my preservation, for preservation of a lot of my materials. In terms of looking at different types of degradation, 55% is still within the safe range. All right, let's use that condition as a new summer set point and say, I'm still going to maintain my 65 degrees, but I'm going to do it at 55% RH. And that means now I only have to dehumidify. Instead of down here to a 36-degree dew point, I'm dehumidifying to a 48-degree dew point, which means that this portion of the year, all of the weather that's happening in here, that portion of the year now, my energy expense, the amount of money that I'm spending to create my preservation environment is significantly lower. I'm getting a satisfactory preservation condition out of it and saving money in the process. So another approach to it. There's a hot and dry or hot and drier for at least part of the year environment. Maybe next time I'll use Denver. Let's try another example. Here we go. Hot, damp environment, 65. Well, all right, if it's hot and humid all throughout the course of the year, let's try 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and we know it's going to cost a lot to dehumidify, so can we do 55% relative humidity? Let's see if we can just get ourselves there and what it takes, right? 49 PI, not great, but still better than 70-50. That's what we're just trying to find some improvement here. Well, what does this take? 70-50 takes a 50-degree dew point. For 65-55 and a significantly better or a significantly slower rate of chemical decay, that takes a 48-degree dew point. Not a whole lot of difference, but holy cow. So here we are in Miami. This is a bit of a challenge, right? Take a look at what's going on outside. Virtually all year round, we have to significantly dehumidify to create an appropriate indoor preservation condition if these are the types of conditions we're looking for. And, you know, for anybody who's with us from South Florida right now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. You guys have seen this before. You know, but when we look at this and go, boy, what can we achieve? Is there any opportunity here really to do something? Well, you know, all right. For seasonal operation, there's not a whole lot of seasonal opportunity here, right? There's not a drier part of the year, if you will, and this is dehumidification all year round. So maybe the answer now, instead of just solely looking at it as a mechanical solution, this is a good opportunity, and obviously there are other good opportunities in the other environments we've discussed. But beyond a mechanical solution here in Miami, now it's time to start looking at different options in terms of what can we do for the building, or what can we do in terms of system efficiency to try and reduce the amount of energy that we're using. And this is an opportunity where we start thinking about how much outside air do we bring into the building? Can we reduce that? How well does our building buffer outdoor conditions? Can we increase thermal insulation? Can we increase the vapor barrier and try to keep the outdoors out of our building? So again, we'll spend some more time on that in these upcoming webinars. And finally, you know, let's deal with a place that's pretty much just kind of like what a lot of us are contending with, especially in the eastern part of the U.S. But what do we do with the seasonal hot, cold, damp, dry, right? Summertime's hot, wet, muggy, sticky. Winter, cold, right? Low dew point condition outdoors. How do we deal with that? What can we get for it? Can we create 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% RH? Well, here we are in St. Paul, right? It doesn't get much colder than that in the U.S. in the wintertime. A few places do. I've never worked in Fargo. That would be a bit of a trick. Interesting to think about in the winter months. But, all right, so if we look at St. Paul and we're trying to do a 42-degree dew point and manage this 45% RH throughout the course of the year, well, that's a good preservation condition. We'd be perfectly happy with what we got. But notice again in terms of work, here we go. A whole lot of dehumidification throughout the year and a whole lot of humidification throughout the rest of it. And holding a flatline condition, virtually no opportunity to not have to do work or not have to do active moisture control on this air as it moves into the building. So that's a lot of energy to be expended. A little bit different approach. Well, if we take it from this seasonal lens and think about, can I use this spectrum of acceptable conditions? I'm going to keep my temperature lower. I'm going to try to get this 65 degrees. But I'm going to allow my seasonal RHs to bump between 35% and 55%. Now, guess what? Sure, there's still a lot of work to be done humidifying in the depths of the winter. That doesn't change. And there's still a lot of dehumidification to be done in the summertime. But notice that these shoulder seasons, here we are in the springtime, give or take between mid-March and up into June. And here we are over here from September to give or take through right about November, or getting into November. Notice that we now have these shoulder season periods where the moisture content outdoors is matching what is going to be acceptable indoors. These outdoor dew points, if we were to allow that moisture content to come in that let it ride scenario, are going to give us RHs that fluctuate between 35 and 55%. Again, right in our safe range of what most of our collections can handle happily. So thinking about it, here's an opportunity to put a floor on it in the wintertime, right? Let's make sure it doesn't get any drier than 35%. We have to humidify here. And in the summertime, we're going to put a ceiling on it, right? We've got to make sure that the dew point doesn't go any higher than 48 degrees. and we're going to get a 55% relative humidity out of that. We're managing for the extremes. We're taking care of the extremes in cold and in low moisture content, and the extremes in heat and high moisture content. And in those middling areas, in those parts of the year where we're within this range of what we've said is our safe range for collections preservation, we're going to try and let things coast as much as possible. And we're going to take advantage of what outdoors is giving us, and we're going to create a better preservation environment for it, or at least an acceptable preservation environment. So when we think about how we approach this, or what information do we have to try and use these approaches, the key here is that we need enough data to know what is going on, not just outdoors, but also indoors. So this is where Chris was talking about during the last webinar, needing at least a year's worth of data for every space that we're working with, or every type of collection space in the outdoor environment, to know how it is that the building responds to what is happening outside. We need this long-term data. And where that year comes in is that it's critical. We cover that change in seasons. We understand both the extremes. Here we are. This is the extreme of summer, and here we are during the dry part of winter and the dew point. And we need to understand, well, not only how does that change from summer to winter over 1 year, but the more data that we have, the better idea we have of what's going on from 1 year to the next. And this is an indoor dew point graph. We see, boy, we didn't do such a hot job controlling it here, but our dehumidification these next 2 years got significantly better. And that's the value of having enough data as we go through. So when we think about this, what are some of the opportunities that we can try to work with? Well, right, we want to take advantage of seasonal conditions. We want to work with what Mother Nature is giving us. So options, we want to stay within the temperature and relative humidity safe ranges. That's kind of the this is first level. This is where we're staying. We have no option, but we need to stay within these particular conditions. We want these cooler temperatures. We want moderate relative humidity. But if outdoors is going to give us cool and dry, right, if it's going to be winter in a lot of places where we have cool conditions and low dew point conditions, well, you know what? Let's try to use that to our advantage. If outdoors is cool and we want cool inside, first step is to make sure that we don't overheat. Right? So if it's 30 degrees outside and I have a storage environment inside with nobody living in it, no people that we have to worry about, do I want to take my storage environment and make it 75 degrees in January in Rochester? No, it doesn't make any sense. Not only do I pay for it in terms of energy, but I also pay for it in terms of preservation quality. If I've got a cold condition outdoors, I want to use everything that I can to try and take advantage of those cooler temperatures to improve my preservation condition, decrease the rate of chemical decay, but also try and reduce the amount of energy that I'm using to create that environment. Now, on the other side of things, if I've got a hot and damp condition, or if I've got a summertime condition throughout a lot of the United States, what can I do? Well, this is where we look at it and go, you know what, these years of thinking about flatline relative humidity conditions are saying it has to be 50% flatline. That's just the rule. We've got to keep it there. That has killed us for ages. And the reality is we don't get that much benefit from it in terms of preservation. If we just relax that relative humidity condition from 50 to 55% for the appropriate collections, recognizing that not everything can take 55% okay, but a lot of things can. Moving that RH condition to 55 degrees or 55% is going to relax an awful lot in terms of the amount of energy that we have to use to maintain that dew point condition inside. And the preservation impact on that is going to be relatively small, especially if we can now look at it and use, if we have a cool, dry condition during the winter months, use that to our advantage to get a slightly better preservation condition for the other part of the year. So think about that. If you live in an environment, whether it's in the United States or anywhere else throughout the world, if you live in an environment where you have seasonal temperature and relative humidity variations, where you truly have a summer season and a winter season, or a wet season and a dry season, think about how it is that you can use that to your advantage for what it is that the collection needs. In other words, when outdoors gives you drier, allow the collection environment to be as dry as is safe, because it's going to pay off for you in the long run. And when outdoors is wetter, when outdoors has high moisture contents, then make sure that you're not trying to dehumidify too far. In other words, don't spend more money than what you truly get to see a significant preservation benefit from. Just keep it within that safe range. Understanding sources of heat and moisture loads. I know we kind of glossed over the idea of load earlier, but By load, I just want you to think of a load as energy in the form of heat or moisture. And the idea is we either have to add energy to the environment or we have to remove it from the environment in order to maintain the set points that we want. And these loads are related to different climate control settings. Really how it works is that the bigger the difference is between what we're trying to do indoors compared to outdoors, not only the greater the load, but also the more money that's going to cost us. And we've got to think about that, and where possible, this is going back to that seasonal approach. We want to try and take advantage of what's going on outdoors, and where it makes sense, make indoors match it as closely as possible. Again, these loads influence the temp and RH in the space. The sources can be from inside or outside, and what we want to do is identify the sources of them. So air infiltration, right. Whoever has had to sit in front of a cold window in the middle of winter, right? Chris is over here raising his hand. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. But yeah, we have a lot of air infiltration through these surfaces, through different leaky parts of the building. I'm not going to go over the graphic, but let's just say windows, doors, right? Older buildings in particular, you get a lot of air exchange that is just part of the construction of the building. It has nothing to do with the mechanical operation. Sources of heat gain and loss through a building. This is just kind of a diagram to give us an idea of what it is we're contending with, right? In the wintertime, heat rises, goes out through the roof. That's why we insulate roofs and attics in a lot of buildings. Heat also goes out through the window. That's why you look at these different kits for trying to put film over a window and increase the thermal insulation or the heat, decrease the heat loss throughout an envelope of a building. In the summertime, not only do we have conductive heat coming in just from air temperature outside, but we also have radiant energy coming in through the sun, through the window. That radiation is heating up the surfaces within the building from the sunlight, and that heating up of the surfaces then gets transferred to the air by convection. So as we're dealing with these issues of we have heat coming from indoors, we have heat coming from outdoors, we're dealing with it from equipment. Who's ever had to work in an office with a whole bunch of photocopiers or printers, or worst of all, I think, are usually the microfilm readers? Those things pour off heat like a madman. So we have heat gain from the environment itself, from the lights, from the equipment that we use, and from the people and occupants as well. So when we think about storage environments, let's try to reduce as many of these as we can. We try to take the equipment or our different computer equipment, photocopiers, microfilm readers, out of the storage environment. We don't want people in the storage environment. Those spaces need to be primarily for collections, not for human comfort. And when you see purpose-built storage spaces, oftentimes we're reducing windows and really trying to button up those envelopes as much as possible. Here's just an example of heat gain real quick, just to kind of visualize it. This is as a result of a nighttime shutdown. But notice here are the outdoor patterns, right? I've got heat gain during the day, the temperature goes up, temperature goes down at night, but notice that even when the temperature goes down at night, we're still talking about 75 to 80 degrees, which is significantly warmer than what they're trying to keep the indoor environment inside the building. And every night when they shut the mechanical system down, we go from the condition that it maintained during the day and will increase by, give or take, about 4 degrees when that system shuts off, as the interior environment responds to what's going on outdoors. You can also see this pattern when you're looking at occupation schedules, when you're looking at lighting operation inside of buildings. It's actually really interesting to see how much energy lights can impart on a particular environment. Every night when people go home and all the lights get turned off, you'll see the space oftentimes cool down by oftentimes at least 1 degree, but sometimes by as much as 2 degrees. Sources of moisture infiltration. All kinds of spaces, right? We know where water comes from. All of us have dealt with a roof leak at one point or another. And for anybody whose storage environment is in a basement or subgrade that has not been properly waterproofed or properly had the water routed around the building, we know what it's like to have moisture coming in either through the walls or just wicking up through the pad in the basement, up through the floor, increasing the relative humidity in that particular part of the building. We also have diffusion issues through the envelope. We talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of vapor pressure and moisture diffusion, having nothing to do with air leaks, just having to do with the movement of moisture through materials, through the envelope, from one side of the building, interior to exterior, or vice versa. And when we look at the building design and the landscaping design, that comes into play as well. You know, what are we dealing with in terms of, do we have a lot of shade, or do we have a lot of plantings around the building that are going to hold moisture in close to the structure? That can be oftentimes quite troublesome. If you walk around and see mold growth or moss growth on the exterior of a building, look around. Is it particularly shady, and is the relative humidity staying high? Just as a quick graphic example of that infiltration, here we go. Here's the dew point in the upstairs of the building in the blue plot. But when we start looking at the basement space and the dew point that we're dealing with in the basement, notice that consistently, especially throughout this period, and here we are again throughout the fall and the early winter, that we're consistently at a higher dew point in that basement area. And really this indicates that we're dealing with an extra moisture source, and what is most likely moisture coming in through the floor of the basement and or the walls of the basement, and something in a phenomenon that we often call rising damp. So this is what it shows up as in graph format. And if you've ever seen this at your institution, well, maybe you've got that going on. So just briefly, we're pretty close. We're going to wrap it up here real quick, but energy and load considerations kind of as a precursor to what we're going to talk about coming up in August. What I want you to think about is that any time that we have to deal with energy, or any time that we have to mechanically remove heat or moisture or add heat or moisture, we're talking about applying dollars, if you will, and oftentimes, unfortunately, in the form of fossil fuel somewhere in the process, to that mechanized process. And what we're talking about throughout this entire series is how do we make preservation more sustainable? How do we make our storage environments? How do we achieve what we need for collections longevity at not only a lower dollar cost, but a lower fuel cost, a lower energy cost in general, in trying to reduce what it is that we have to do in order to maintain these environments that are appropriate for long-term preservation. You know, from a dollars and cents perspective, in terms of the different modes that we can do or different operations, heating, cooling, dehumidifying, humidifying, humidification is one of the least expensive mechanical operations that we can do. So it can be very difficult to control, but it doesn't necessarily cost as much as some of the other functions that we might have to perform. You flip that to the other side and you look at what was happening in the graphs that we looked at for Miami, or what happens here in Rochester in the summertime. Dehumidification or moisture removal is one of the most energy intensive and expensive processes that we can do inside of any particular environment. So again, this is a good reason when we think about sustainability to make sure that we're not dehumidifying more than what the collection actually needs, and thinking about what we have and what those relative humidity conditions need to be for long-term preservation. And think about redefining your set points or redefining your approaches in terms of these minimum and maximum relative humidity conditions. You know, it gives us really the opportunity to look at this and say, all right, as long as I stay between this band of what we've deemed to be safe, then I'm satisfied, or that's a good preservation environment to maintain. If you live in an area where you've got cooler seasons or cold seasons during the wintertime, when it comes to that heating season when you're tempted to increase the temperature in the space or maintain a steady set point temperature, think about choosing a cooler set point if you can achieve it in order to save energy on heating and reduce humidification. But you know what, at the same time, you're going to be improving preservation as well. And finally, we'll talk about this again in far greater depth in a couple of months. But every bit of outside air that we bring into the building has to be conditioned to what we want it to be. So whether it's coming in via infiltration and cracks and leaks in the structure, or whether we bring it in on purpose through the mechanical system, that's money that we have to spend to control the environment. Summary, right? It's all about the dew point. Understand the outdoor conditions, work with your environment when possible. Try to work with what's going on outside. And really understand how it is that your outdoor environment influences the interior environment and what role your building and your structure play in that. And finally, I hope as we were talking about and going through this today, think about where you are and what your external environment is like, and begin formulating your own strategy. Begin thinking about what are our challenges and what do we have to contend with, and where is that intersection, or how do we find that coexistence between preservation and sustainability. These next few months, we're going to be talking a lot more in terms of strategies and in terms of what can we actually do to try and make these two goals, these simultaneously goals, work a little bit better together, and how do we get to that optimal definition we put out earlier. So, coming up, June 10th, equilibration and enclosures. This is a fun one. This is based on recent research we just finished up here at IPI, so looking forward to talking with you about that, and hopefully it will give folks some good ideas about how materials actually respond to environmental changes within spaces. And then July and August, we're going to look at building envelopes. July, we're really going to focus on passive control and envelopes. And August, we're going to look at mechanical systems and how they run and what we can do in terms of understanding what their interaction is with the environment. Specifically, equilibration enclosures, dryness, dampness. We'll move on. Let's get to some questions here for a minute. There's the project website. By the way, just at the end, before I lose everybody, please do fill out that survey that's going to be emailed out to you as soon as we wrap things up with the webinar. We do use those not only to make changes and hopefully make some improvements to the upcoming webinars, but we also send and share those surveys with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they really appreciate knowing what your feedback was in terms of the content and this entire series that they're funding and allowing us to present for them. So let's get to some questions real quick. All right. Give me one moment while I increase this a little bit. All right. Here's a question from Marilena Gianna Carey. Thanks, Marilena. So why do you say that when temp rises, relative humidity descends? It doesn't seem so black and white. In my experience from Greece climate, disproves it in the summer. Okay, it's a good question, Marilena. And if you're sitting in Greece right now, hi, and I'm not sure what time it is, but thanks for joining us. This is just the psychrometric relationship. So when we look at dew point, keep in mind that that relationship, temperature rising and relative humidity dropping, all has to do with a similar moisture content or with a flat moisture content in the environment. So if your dew point remains the same, in other words, if we keep a 50-degree dew point all the time, or let's say, for example, if we maintain a 14-degree C dew point all the time, I don't remember exactly what that converts to in Fahrenheit, but work with me. If we maintain a 14-degree C dew point all the time, as long as that dew point condition is maintained steadily and we keep it at 14 C, then as we increase the temperature in the environment, the relative humidity will go down. And as we decrease the temperature in the environment, the relative humidity will go up. Most likely what you're experiencing in terms of thinking about it in your outdoor climate or even what you're contending with inside of your building largely has an awful lot to do with the fact that if you see temperature going up and relative humidity going up at the same time, the indication is that the dew point or the moisture content of the environment went up as well. And so think about if you're taking data from your space or if you're data logging, compare those temp and RH and dew point graphs and see if that might be the case. Got another question here from Ron Martin. Ron is asking, all right, I'm going to read this whole thing and probably try to take it bit by bit. Is there software or a variant of the dew point calculator that can be used to advise on the effects of seasonal drift over a long period of time? Okay, that is, for example, if I want to save energy by switching off my air conditioning plant at night, how can I check if I am shooting myself in my preservation foot? Very nice. I'm not sure what your other foot might be, but hopefully they're both preservation feet, in my attempts to save on my energy bill. Ron, I'm not sure where you're from. If you're not familiar with eClimate Notebook, and Chris was giving a very quick introduction to eClimate Notebook during the last webinar last month. But I think if you're asking for how do I recognize these effects over time and what is it that seasonal drift does, eClimate Notebook is the place to do that. You're absolutely right. Dew point calculator, the limitation really when we're dialing in those conditions on the sliders is you're looking at a condition that really represents a single snapshot in time. If you have that flatline condition, then yeah, you could say this equates to over time, but really flatline doesn't exist in real life, so you have a moment of 70-50, and that's what the rate of decay would be at 70 degrees and 50% RH. That said, in terms of how you deal with that seasonal drift or changing conditions over time, the only way to do it is with existing data. I want to try and answer this as clearly as I can, but it takes having data from your environment, it takes data logging and knowing what the conditions are over time in order to understand what the impact is of those different conditions. So if you have data loggers in the environment, and this is where eClimate Notebook comes into play, and the preservation metrics, is by uploading that data from your preservation environment into eClimate Notebook, you can apply the algorithms that create the preservation metrics to that data and see what that sum total impact of those different environmental conditions is on preservation. Now, the problem is that because there's no way to model, if you will, everybody's situation is unique, every building is different, every environment is slightly different, there's no way to model in a dew point calculator style form, in other words, just with dialing in random conditions or dialing in random temperatures and relative humidities, to model that in a, shall I say, not real application. You do need to have actual data to work with, but eClimate Notebook will do that for you. It tells you what the preservation condition or the preservation impact over time is, and you can compare that to looking at your energy expenditures or looking at your energy bills for your institution. And if you start making some adjustments or thinking about approaching this a little bit differently, you can then compare your preservation quality over time, or even over a short period of time, to what's happening with the energy usage in the building or for that particular mechanical system. The rest of your question, how do we add in air tightness to the mix? And perhaps it makes more sense to spend funds on air tightness than energy. Absolutely, I'm on board with you. We just haven't gotten there yet. Adding air tightness into the mix, what it comes down to is, yeah, if you've got a leaky building that doesn't have a lot of thermal insulating capacity or doesn't have a vapor barrier, it doesn't matter what you do. You're going to spend an awful lot to create an interior environment that's significantly different than the exterior environment. But for a lot of places, in terms of long-term impact, absolutely. Rather than going after the system, and this is actually something that we teach and consult on an awful lot, go after the envelope first and go after envelope improvements and looking at making improvements in terms of building tightness and reduction of air infiltration before you go after replacing a mechanical system, or before you go after even making significant upgrades to a mechanical system, because you can reduce the load significantly by just looking at the building and looking at the structure itself. So thanks for bringing that up. It was a really good point. Let's see here. Got a question. I realize we're a little bit over, but I hope you'll stay with me. Okay, we've got 2 more questions to cover. This one's from Neetha. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Neetha or Natha Cloter. The question is, what are the 2 main types of humidity control systems? I'm going to try to approach this in a couple different ways. It really depends on how you take that idea of humidity control. I'm not sure if you're referring to dehumidification or humidification, but in either case, there are a number of different mechanical operations that you can use. If we talk about dehumidification or moisture removal for a moment, you can do it with a heating coil and cooling coil arrangement where the cooling coil comes first, the heating coil comes second, and that's called a subcool and reheat system, or subcool and reheat operation. It cools the air down, condenses moisture out, and then reheats the temperature of the air back up to get the appropriate relative humidity. The other, and again, among others, but another, shall we say, common means of dehumidification that you run into, especially where dehumidification is a primary operation of concern, is what we call a desiccant system. And I won't go into real great detail here in terms of trying to explain that process, other than to say that it uses a desiccant material to try and remove the moisture from the airflow or from the airstream, and then cools the air back down. We'll talk about desiccants in a lot more detail when we get to the August webinar. I hope you'll be able to join us for that. There's also information on that in a lot of the different seminars and webinars that we've given on ipisustainability.org. For humidification, take your pick of about between a handful and 2 handfuls of different types of systems that can be used. But really it varies. Oftentimes it varies in terms of the amount of humidification that you have to do. There are electric canister systems that are very common in a lot of smaller applications. There are direct steam systems. There are ultrasonic systems. And from there, in terms of creating the steam or creating the moisture, you have steam-to-steam heat exchangers, you have clean steam systems, you have RO feeding into a steam system, you have direct steam from a domestic source system, a lot of different ways of cutting it. But again, we'll cover some of those and kind of try to lay out a few of those different types of animals when we get to the mechanical system talk that's coming up in August. If you have other questions about that, or you're really looking for an answer now for whatever particular reason, feel free to drop us an email and we'll get back to you with, or get in touch with you on the phone and try to answer some of those with a little more detail. Final question to cover is from Ann Bevan. How do you manage the gradual shift in RH during the shoulder seasons to meet the change in set points for the winter and summer seasons? Good question. And that's really something that I'm sorry I didn't go into in a little bit more detail. But what it comes down to, and this is presuming, it's easiest first to think about it in terms of maybe maintaining a steady set point temperature. But the reality is that that gradual shift in relative humidity What we work with here at IPI, based on research that's been done not only by us, and the equilibration talk next month I think is going to help with this a little bit, but the other thing that comes into play is a lot of the mechanical damage or a lot of the mechanical change research that has been done in years past. Everyone from Marion Mecklenburg to Stefan Mikowski to a number of other folks in the field have looked at this mechanical shape change and what is the impact of relative humidity change or relative humidity shift on materials and on collections objects. The answer in a nutshell really is that as long as we stay between 35 and 55%, from what we're learning for most materials, not all, but for most materials, as long as you maintain that minimum of 35% and that maximum of 55%, the majority of our collections materials are going to coexist perfectly happily between those two RH conditions, regardless of how often or how quickly that relative humidity shifts between 35 and 55. Which is to say that if you go from 35 to 38 to 52% back down to 40%, the equilibration rate for a lot of our materials is slow enough that they're not going to feel the majority of those changes. There's more research to be done on that, but all the research so far is indicating that a lot of materials can withstand that movement between 35 and 55 very safely. I hope that that answers your question. Again, if there's some other aspect of that, or if there was a different angle that you wanted me to approach that with, drop us a line. Let us know in the evaluation, and we'll try and get in touch with you and clear that up a little bit. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We're about 6 minutes over, but thanks for sticking with us. Everybody take care. We'll talk to you again coming up here in June. Thank you. Bye.